Okay, let's continue to talk a little bit about these printing methods. So when would you use your amplitude modulation printing? Well, keep in mind that it can create patterns inside of here. And we can see that, right? That we've got these little lines going side to side. It creates a pattern even as we zoom out. You may be able to see some shape coming in. Now, some of these are optical illusions, and some of these are actual patterns being produced depending on how things are rotated. And this is sometimes referred to as a moire effect. So you'll want to watch out for that, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes when we get into how all of these produce color images. Now, we can use different line angles, and sometimes we'll use different line counts. And what a line is has to do with how the amplitude modulation printing is done. So if you're just using like a dot matrix printer, for example, that's the old school printer that just kind of goes side to side and punches down some dots as it goes, you could think of that sort of as either an FM or an AM, depending on how you set it. But some place that you specifically have this is the AM printing is in t-shirt prints. And so what will happen is sort of a long process here. Let me go ahead and create some visualization for you. Well, oops. Yeah, I know it doesn't take 0 inches. That's why I was trying to type in 10. All right, let me get my pen, which I left just out of reach. Okay, so what essentially occurs, let's say you're printing a t-shirt and you're going to be screen printing a t-shirt using a CMYK process. Well, I'll get into that a little bit more, but what essentially happens is this. You begin by doing some kind of cool graphic. And in some cases, you may accidentally do white on white and you won't be able to see anything. So let's try that again. You produce some kind of cool graphic. Now, what you do is you'd send this to your standard printer, right, that you've got hooked up. And then you would print out on normally a piece of paper, right, to get this going. But what you can do instead is print it out on something called a transparency. And really it's just a piece of plastic that you can see through. So if you put your hand on one side of it, you'd be able to see your hand all the way through it. And that way you can do something pretty cool where you shine light through this. Now, why would you really want to do that if you weren't setting it up on a projector or something? Well, the reason is the next step. You'd get something called a screen. Now, a screen could literally be a little metal mesh like you'd have in your window for a screen, or it could be something more like a piece of fine cloth that has gaps in it, as you normally would have. So in cloth, usually it's so small you can't really see it, right? The weave is going on. But if you have something like a stretchy sock and you stretch the sock out really, really far with both your hands, you can see that there would be little gaps in it. And those gaps are what we would refer to as our line count. And it's usually referred to as how many you have per square inch. And so a pretty common one, for example, is 150 line count. You'll see that a lot. And that means that, you'll see that on, for example, if you were printing out a poster or something, you could ask, what's line count on this? They'd say, well, it's 150. So that means that every square inch has about 150 little holes that you can push ink through. So fine and dandy, but what's the point of that? So let's say you're doing the screen printing at home and you're going to make a cool t-shirt for your band. So you'd attach this screen to a frame, and I literally mean just like a frame. You could get a frame from like Michael's or whatever and put that in. And depending on how you rotate this piece of fabric or screen, you could have it just going straight up and down. That would be referred to as a 0 degree rotation going in. You haven't done anything. Or I was saying that we had a 45 degree. Essentially, you've just rotated the cloth 45 degrees before you stapled it across the entire frame. And you can see I did not have a big enough piece of cloth. So you staple that down and you end up with your frame with your screen on it. And so that will be your new screen, right? So even if I just did 0, let's say we're only doing one color, so it doesn't really matter. We'll talk more about why the angles matter in a bit. So you have all of that. Then what you do is go down and buy what's referred to as either a light sensitive or photosensitive emulsion. And what that would do is keep this in a nice opaque container so that it doesn't dry. All it does is when exposed to UV light, harden. Okay, so what's the point to that? Well, it's this. You take your frame that now has your screen in it, and you rub this emulsion maybe with a big squeegee like you'd use to clean your car's windshield. You scrape that across so you have a nice thick emulsion over everything, just a big old blob on there. And now that's light sensitive. So now you can take that cool graphic you designed earlier, and you can place that on top of your screen. Right? Now, wherever the UV light comes through, that emulsion will harden. So what's the point to all of that, you may ask? Well, what happens now is you just leave it out in the sun, for example, for a while. And what you'll have is everywhere that wasn't covered, you'll have a hard emulsion. And I'm just going to put it, that generally doesn't change color. Maybe it gets a little more tan, but it's about the same. So, or you could put it under a UV light bulb if you wanted to speed up the process. And you just have a soft emulsion still wherever the image, the black part of the image, was blocking it. So you could then take, a hose and spray some water on that and just wash out that material that's still soft, and that will leave a sort of stencil for you. Okay, so now we've got the stencil. Let me go ahead and save this so it doesn't crash out. So now that you have this this stencil you created by washing out the still soft enamel from the screen, you can take that, and then you can take a, what do you mean? Yeah, of course it's hidden. Computers only do what you tell them to and not what you want them to. So you can take a little t-shirt, and then once you have your t-shirt and you've got your new stencil that's put into this screen, it's essentially burned into the screen is the way that it's generally referred to on this frame. Keep in mind that there won't really be a big color difference, if any at all. You press this on top of your shirt, and generally you'll have some sort of locking mechanism to do that. And then once you've got your screen pressed on with your image burned in, you take a pigment such as black, for example, and then you'll want to use one that can work on fabric, and you just pour some on your screen, and then again you take that good old squeegee and you'd press it down here and rub it across. And what would all that do? Well, that would transfer essentially from the burned image. It would transfer onto your shirt your graphic that you designed, and it's ready to be worn. And so if this was, for example, a band t-shirt or something, you're ready to sell that thing. And the whole process gets very interesting because that's just with one color. Yeah, we just printed it on. What happens if you want to do multiple colors? We'll get to the way that you do that, and it has to do with rotating the lines and your line count and which pigments go down first and all that stuff. But on larger machines, what you actually end up having is multiple screens, one for each color that you're going to put down. And it's usually cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. And then you also have your t-shirt color, be it white or blue or green or whatever, but you'll put this on sort of a rotating process if you want to be cool about it. Now you don't need this, you could just try to line stuff up, and you'd put on your image, you'd bring your image in for each of these things, and then you'd put down the t-shirt, you'd hold it in place, and then you'd stamp this thing down, and then you'd rub the different colored ink, be it cyan, magenta, yellow, or black, across it one at a time, and you'd build up your different colors. Now, you don't have to be so crazy as to build this whole mechanism. What you can do instead is just be very careful. You can pin your shirt down to like a board or something that would fit exactly inside of your frame. And then you can just swap out for different frames one at a time. So you do like your cyan, and then you'd switch it out for your magenta, and then you'd switch it out for your black afterwards, all that good stuff. Just one at a time, you'd swap it out, and then you'd run your different colors over it, and then you'd be set. So that's a 4-color printing process, but there's more to it than all of that. You can actually use any color that you can mix. We'll get more into that in a minute. But that's how the printing process for a t-shirt would work. And now let's go all the way back over here. And yes, can't brush on a group. So if we pop back over here, all of a sudden this makes a little more sense. That screen that we were talking about, be it a cloth or an actual wire or what have you, has so many lines, just like this has lines. It has so many gaps, which would produce these dots. Now, the difference being that on a screen, the amplitude modulation isn't really occurring there, in that those dots are exactly the same. So what you're really talking about is basically having an underlying grid. Here we go. Okay, get my brush now. An underlying grid, right, of your cloth or wire or whatever. Now, normally it is just a cloth. An underlying grid. And then on the image that's printing, you're basically making these circles, and I've zoomed in far too close. Let me zoom out here. You're making these circles that are essentially made out of different numbers of those dots. So if you have those dots, those holes. So if you have a circle that would fit through one of the gaps inside of it, and it's only one large, then voila, you'd have a small one. If you had one that encompassed 4 of them, voila, you'd have a large dot. It's the same sort of principle when we're just drawing in Photoshop, and we produce these lines, right, that are actually made out of a number of pixels. Now that line count on our screen becomes our pixel count. So we're able to produce those dots, those AM dots, even though we only have a uniform scale or spacing between them on the actual screen itself. So now we come back to why? Well, so that we can again produce this gradient. By covering fewer of those holes, we can produce this gradient effect. Now that's for our AM process, our amplitude modulation process, which again, I'm not used to this, the pulse width modulation process. But that's not true for your stochastic process, your FM modulation process. That one's a little bit different. So let's finish talking about the amplitude modulation, because this is what we're going to be focusing on for this assignment. But it's important to know about the other ones so you can ask appropriate questions when you're going to a print company that is going to print all of your stuff. So for the amplitude modulation one, we're going to go over how you do that multiple color process. Remember, I was saying something about rotating to different degrees using different lightness and darkness. We'll get into all of that in a little bit. But something you need to keep in mind is the screen count, because you're going to have to convert things over. So this matters less in our world, because again, this is just a conceptual printer that I've come up with. But when you actually go to print, you need to know what the frequency count is, because in general, but not always, in general, you want about 2 times the screen line in resolution of your document. What? Okay, so think of it this way. Remember how I said that 150 is pretty common for standard sheet of paper, so if you're making a poster or something? assuming that the ink you're using on your t-shirt print, it doesn't bleed very much, and the cotton that you're using isn't so absorbent like a sponge that it's just smushing everywhere and you get this huge amount of bleed. Assume that that's fine, that it just sits there on top of the surface and it looks great, all that good stuff. And you're told that you have 150 lines per inch there. It's your screen count, your line count there. Well, what are you going to set your resolution of your document to? Generally, it's going to be twice the size. Now, I've been told that you can rely on like 1.5 times the size. I honestly, when I have done prints like books and things like that kind of stuff, I send it off to the printer, and then I get samples back and I get it back. So I've just been told 300 resolution, and in the past those guys have been using like 150. So I'm going to say stick with the 2 times, but ask whoever's running your print equipment, because that's what really matters. But if you're doing it yourself, 2 times should work fine if you're doing a whole home setup and everything. So in that case, if it's 150 line count, you're going to use 300 pixels per inch, and that should convert over pretty nicely. And that will go through. Now, there's something called a ripping process, and that's referred to as a raster image profiler process. That's just when... So you see how I have text up here? And if I just sent this Photoshop document to my printer, magically everything would just print like on my LaserJet? Like miraculous. How does that all happen? Well, either the printing software or Photoshop or the printer itself, one of those guys would have a piece of software that would have to convert this vector graphic it would have to rasterize it. And so that process is called the ripping process, or the raster image profiler process. I had to write that one down because I never refer to it. It's so abstract that it's rarely something you have to think of, but it's possible to overwhelm it on some digital machines. So you need to be careful not to give such a high resolution that the printer doesn't print anything. So you really do want to work with whoever's printing in order to set all that up going in. So essentially that's the AM. Let's talk just a bit about the FM. I know this video is running on a little bit long, but we'll wrap this guy up. So the FM processing doesn't really have a line count, so you don't really have to worry about a lot of this kind of stuff. So for example, you can imagine on these dots over here, something very fine like a very small text type wouldn't show up very well. And in fact, if you had something like a pattern, that may not show up very well. So actually, let's go ahead and go into another video, because this is probably going to be another 5 or 10 minutes. I'll see you as we talk about patterns inside of patterns.